The People's Platform.
Join me this week on the People's Platform while I speak to some of the most phenomenal writers, both local and international, here in the historic city of Gaul at the Gaul Literary Festival.
Dr. Radha Kumar is the former chair of United Nations University Council. Previously, she was Director General of the Delhi Policy Group, the first independent think tank in India. She's a specialist in ethnic conflicts, peacemaking and peace building, often from a feminist perspective. She has written 5 books and numerous journal articles on the topic and holds a PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University, India, and an MA and BA from Cambridge University. I'm in conversation with Radha Kumar. She is a scholar, author, policy analyst known for her work in peacemaking and peace building. Thank you for joining us, Radha.
Thank you, Sonali.
Radha, your work has exclusively focused on peace building, conflict resolution. Increasingly, the world we live in, we're living in today is warring, unhappy, grieving, hurting. And we are also desensitized to the pain of the other. In such a context, how can policy making help? Or does it even help? Because if governments don't care enough, then where do we go to from there?
That's a huge set of questions. I think that, first of all, in a situation like this, where, as you rightly say, there are resurgences of war in its most brutal forms, Israel-Palestine being a case in point. It seems that you need actually far greater civil society pressure, and all of us have to volunteer or step up to push our governments. And I do feel that there are a lot of governments that are anguished by the wars that are going on. In fact, neighborhood, bordering countries, I feel are now less involved in perpetuating war than they were, say, 20 years ago. If you look at the wars of the post-Cold War period, in almost every case, neighbors were involved in actually fomenting the war. In this case, I feel now today, we are seeing more regionalized wars without so much cross-border support. And that should be considered a good thing, because it creates more scope for peacemaking. Coming to the peacemaking issue, yes, you're right. There is less rather than more intervention to make peace than there was, say, 20 years ago. And I think that is partly to do with the kinds of global crises that have occurred over the past 20 years. It's going to take time, I think, for the international community to come back to recognizing that one of its chief purposes is peacemaking globally. We know that there is a left versus right, or a democrat versus authoritarian polarization happening at this moment in time. And I think that has made it also all the more difficult for countries to intervene. It seems as if there's almost a replay of the Cold War, or Cold War axes developing. That we thought 20 years ago had ended for good.
Have we learned from our past? We say never again, but here we are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are we regressing?
Well, you know, history, unfortunately, has never been a linear process. And you find cycles of violence constantly recurring. So I think that if we look at where peace has led to stability and non-recurrence of violence or conflict. That is generally in the very rare situations in which civil society and political power have come together to ensure no recurrence of conflict. That is very rare indeed. There's also the other question, people will make distinctions. We will say that, well, even a frozen conflict is better than a hot live conflict. And often the international community will say, okay, at least this is now frozen, and their attention will move elsewhere. So at the end of the day, it will always come back to local communities and their elected administrations to take the further steps that are required.
We speak about the importance of institutions, and from a global perspective, we have international bodies such as the United Nations. We have international courts such as the International Court of Justice, the ICC. We have concepts such as universal jurisdiction. And we have sovereign states with rules and regulations and laws and morals and ethics and rationality and humanity, supposedly. But these have proven to be futile in the wake of the killings, the rapes, the looting that is happening, almost war crimes and genocides happening before our eyes, which we view on our smartphones and just scroll past and move on with our lives because we have lives to live. This has become our life.
I have to say that I really didn't think that I would see the kinds of appalling bombings, denial of food and medical aid that this Israel-Palestine war is showing. And yeah, it's beyond speech. It's so inhuman what is being done there. I think that I don't think we scroll past, actually. I mean, if I look just at this instance, the kinds of protests that we have seen all across the world against what Israel is doing in Gaza, which of course does not excuse what Hamas did on the 7th of October, but this retaliation is inhuman and barbaric and vengeful and just nasty in every possible way, brutal. But I do see huge protests everywhere, and including on social media. And what that indicates to me is that that has put some pressure, for example, on the Biden administration. To not continue to give the free pass that it has given Israel. So I wouldn't undervalue that. I think it is huge, but where you are right is that it's been 3 months of this war, and one would have hoped that the public protests would have forced an earlier intervention. And even today, the war is ongoing. We do not know whether the pressure will be sufficient to make Israel stop. And that is a problem to consider. But, bear in mind that, in general, countries do not like to intervene when they don't have a direct interest. And generally, interventions based on interest are interventions that are looking for conquest or for, non-peace and quite often anti-peace actions. When it comes to actually disinterested peacemaking actions, dialogue, yes, diplomacy, yes, but actual strong action, for example, sanctions, cutting off aid, forcing, if you like, an administration to fall in line, that is very rare indeed. And often, and it's rare also because often it involves more than things like sanctions. It might involve sending troops in. People are very hesitant to do that.
Who wield massive power, and they can choose to do with this power what they will. They can either do good, be indifferent, or do evil. How do we societally ensure that those who wield power are the good guys and not the bad guys?
Well, in a democracy, that's supposed to be the function of an election. But more than elections, if I look at my own country, India, one of the things that strikes me is that the range and depth of inequality in our country means that not everyone subscribes to the fundamentals of democracy, because democracy is not elections alone. Democracy is consultation, democracy is putting the people's needs and rights first, education, healthcare, participation in institutions, in joint institutions, and that's how the values and the culture build up. We have not done that. Sri Lanka, I think, is a slightly different case. But if you look at the rest of South Asia, none of us have been able to bridge the inequality gap sufficiently to create a strong democratic institutions. And if you don't have those institutions, and if the people don't have a real understanding of what it takes to make a democracy work, those shared values, if they don't have them, then the risk of weakness and collapse is imminent.
Conflict resolution doesn't mean that powerful nations just throw aid and money and charity at warring, poorer nations. There has to be emotional facilitation of sorts. How do you see this? Do you also see a massive problem in this throwing aid kind of template?
I think that there is a real flaw in this understanding that economic betterment solves conflicts. It doesn't. It can move them to another level. But the idea that you can somehow use economic incentives to make warring parties come together, or that you can then post a peace agreement, use economic incentives to implement the agreement, that actually has been shown to be fallacious. No matter how much aid you give, the conflict will not end unless you address the root causes. In the case of ethnic conflicts, it's about ethnic identities and perceived grievances. You know, in East Europe, they actually coined the term imperial minority. Now, you know, a minority is a minority is a minority. It is not an imperial minority. That is, you know, a contradiction in terms. So, but there's that problem. And you saw that problem when the former Soviet Union dissolved, with small stranded groups of Russians in different parts of the new sovereign countries. So, and prior to that, of course, you saw people talking about Jews in that way. This is prior to World War II, World War I, World War II in between. So we have to start talking very seriously about what role do economic incentives play? There is no doubt that they will play a role, but they will never be enough on their own. They have to be accompanied by political, most of all political, and then this understanding of tolerance and living together. That has to come. There's no shortcut for that. You have, you know, those initiatives have to be taken to ensure those values penetrate.
I'd love to hear your perspectives on the concept of insecurity of government and political administration as juxtaposed with the need to have more women in conflict resolution in a meaningful way. The inclusion of women at conceptualization stage, at decision-making stage, but in a real way.
It's a difficult one. So first of all, I think we in civil society often tend to see governments as powerful. We don't see that in many cases they are deeply insecure. I mean, I have had to think about this in terms of India over the past 8 years, why this rise of chauvinist nationalism, why this rise of authoritarianism. And my conclusion is that I did not sufficiently prioritize how insecure people are, or political elements are in our country. Now, so the first point is that if you really want policy change, you also need to help make the policy makers feel more secure and more confident in their abilities, which is something we rarely do. We criticize all the time. We rarely give praise when praise is due. And we need to actually redouble the praise. You might not even feel it very sincerely, but you need to shout it from the housetops if you want that policy maker to go further. The second point about women, you know, one of the dichotomies is that women's groups have been very active in peace movements across the world. And yet, when it comes to decision making, they are rarely included, as you say. Now, there are 2 points here. There is, unfortunately, in political discourse, there's always an element of tokenism. So people will say, oh, well, you know, what are you talking about? There's a woman prime minister, or there is a woman foreign minister. But often the price that people have to pay to become a woman has to pay to become prime minister or foreign minister is to adopt or conform to the same norms and rules of power play as men do. So I don't think having women in top positions necessarily will make a policy difference when it comes to peacemaking. Okay. The question then becomes, how do women in peace movements begin to assert themselves? And we have seen examples of that. You've seen examples of women coming together boycotting spoilers, or mobilizing entire families and local communities through women's activism. That is a powerful force. When it comes to peacemaking, generally you will find that it is the warlords who become the key actors. And you can understand why. You can understand why, because unless they agree to give up arms and disperse, I mean, you won't be able to move towards an actual peace agreement. I think that what, you know, irrespective of the process whereby you come to a peace agreement, what any government that is involved in searching for peace or international community need to recognize is that while you're moving towards negotiations, you also need to be thinking very seriously about what happens post the peace agreement. Women's role in reconstruction, stabilization is invaluable, and we've seen it. Who built post-war Germany? Who built post-war Yugoslavia? It was women in much greater numbers than men. So start planning and thinking ahead of that, and then you open up the space for women's participation. And not only that, it's a win-win, because they are ultimately the people who will create the stability on the ground.
Rather, do you feel like you write so much as an activist scholar, and then you see the ground realities, a world that's at war. There is a disconnect between academia and the real world. How do you propose this gap can be bridged? And how do you continue to do the work you do without being jaded?
I think I have had a few moments of luck in my life. So on Bosnia or Macedonia, Kosovo and so on, I was part of various groups that were able to offer policy proposals, some of which got adopted. In India, the government, the previous government, the Manmohan Singh administration, appointed me, along with two others, as an interlocutor for Jammu and Kashmir. So I was able actually to do quite a lot on the ground. But I also would say that Indian civil society groups have often been able to achieve quite a lot on the ground. You know, when I worked with civil society groups from Jammu and Kashmir, we were able to get the Manmohan Singh administration to adopt key confidence-building measures vis-à-vis Pakistan as well as Jammu and Kashmir, freedom of trade, freedom of movement, and so on. And those were enormous breakthroughs. So in my experience, you can actually achieve quite a bit. And I would say that the interesting thing for me was to find that when I was working with civil society groups, we had a greater impact than when I was a government interlocutor. In terms of the policies we proposed as civil society got adopted much more readily than the policies we suggested as government interlocutors. Because there's a responsibility, right? I mean, if you're a government interlocutor, government has to take responsibility for if they take any of your policies on board. If you're civil society, government may take your policies, but they can always blame civil society when something goes wrong. So that's what I mean about recognizing insecurities and recognize the need and importance to constantly praise somebody who does even a little bit of the right thing.
Thank you so much, Radha.
My
Kumar.
pleasure.
This was wonderful. Thank you.
The People's Platform.
TV1. TV for life.
Kehelia resigns. Requests home-cooked meals while in remand. Group assaulted during Wilpattu land inquiry. 10 billion rupees for the presidential and parliamentary elections this year. Did India send a battle submarine to Sri Lanka due to Chinese research vessel presence? Anura Kumara and delegation travel to India's Ahmedabad. Operation Yuktiya completes 50 days. Over 55,000 suspects arrested.
TV1. TV for life.
පිරිසිදු වතුර බොන්නට නැතිවුණත් ගම්මාන දෙකක පවුල් 300ක් පමණ එකම ලිඳකින් ජලය සපයාගන්න විදි දුක්ගැහැට නිමා කරමින් අනුරාධපුර මහවිලච්චිය ඉට් කලාපේ කැලි අමුණුකොලි සහ බලුගස්වැව ගම්මානවල ජනතාවට පිරිසිදු පානීය ජල පෙරණයක් ලබා දුන් වගයි. ගම්මැද්ද රට නගන ජන පෞර.
මාත්‍රීතුමා මොකද හදිස්සියෙන්?
ඒ මගේ ෆෝන් කෝල්ස් ආන්සර් කරන්නේ නැත්තේ.
ආන්සර් කරන්න ඕනේ නැහැ කියලා හිතුණා.
කරපු හැම තේරෙම ගොඩාක් පිං. මම මේ chance එක ගන්න අවුරුදු කීයක් කට්ට ගෑවද? මට පුළු උපරිම කරනවා මචං එහෙම.
මෙයාත් ඔයගේ જાතියෙමද?
එයාගේ මහල බලන්න.
මන්ත්‍රීතුමා හරි. ඒ දෙන්නම එක වගේ.
මොකෙක් හරි පට්ට හොරෙක් ඇවිල්ලා මම බෝධිසත්වයෙක් කිව්වම උට දන ගගහ පෙරලි වඳිනුම් මේ රටේ ඉන්නේ.
නෑ මං කියන මොන වගේ දෙයක්ද බලන්නේ කියලා කිව්වොත් මට පෙන්වන්න පුළුවන්.
මම හැම දෙයක්ම වගේ බලනවා.
සර්කස් කාරයෝ අද රාත්‍රී 8ට සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්